Okay, so I wanted to finish this with a part four of this video series on Miriam, the sister of Moses, and the ritual of the red heifer, and also in the Christian mythos, the Virgin Mary, and um, her connection to the Second Temple in Jerusalem, otherwise known as Herod's Temple. Um, so, some things that I didn't really um, didn't really dig into that much or emphasize rather that much in the last portion was that the high priest, given that the temple architecture is seems to be based on the language used um, even in the Hebrew Tanakh of the very various portions of the temple. It does seem to be based on um, feminine anatomy, and that's really in keeping with temples, yeah, basically ancient temples, is that uh, they're believed to have started with caves in the earth, and then the cave was seen as the womb, with the entrance being the vaginal canal, and um, so that they were like the womb of the Mother Earth. And and then I showed how the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, um, refers to uh, um, was it Athena, the Virgin? Um, Let me look at that real quick. Um, yeah, so Athena, who was also called Athena the Virgin. In the final decade of the 6th century AD, the Parthenon was converted into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Wow. Oh, wow. So, so they took the temple dedicated to the Virgin Athena, and then they dedicated it to the Virgin Mary. So they just, from one virgin to another. So, I mean, that's not really evidence of anything because lots of pagan, uh, pagan art, pagan architecture, pagan everything, pagan literature was Christianized and appropriated by Christianity in later centuries. So, but it is amusing that there's such a direct connection between the two. Um, anyway, so this shows then that here's another structure that's uh, dedicated, to the feminine, um, and in this case, a virgin. So uh, to get back to the Second Temple, otherwise known as Herod's Temple, because Herod uh, worked to renovate it, and I think he also worked on increasing the size of the Temple Mount through the erection of retaining walls so that it would increase the size of the plateau on the Temple Mount. And I can't really tell you which Herod because there's so many Herods that I um, I lose track. So, and while the Herods certainly have some relevance to the first century, I don't find myself specializing in the Herods. I don't think the Caesar's Messiah thesis rises or falls upon anything the Herods did. So, so given that the Second Temple architecture is seems to be um, evocative of feminine anatomy at the very least, uh, we can see um, through the entry of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol or Kohen Hagadol. I think it's depending on your source, I guess. The so Kohen would be priest, and then Gadol would be great. So the great priest. Um, uh, anyway, the high priest would enter uh, once a year into the most holy place or the Holy of Holies. Um, I believe on the Day of Atonement on Yom Kippur. So, but the veil of the temple, veil or curtain if you prefer, of the temple would remain intact, even though the high priest entered the most holy place. So the second temple had something akin to perpetual virginity, like the Virgin Mary is supposed to have had in at least in at the very least Roman Catholic Christianity, which I'm sorry, Protestants, but Roman Catholicism, despite all its strange trappings, it actually has a line straight to the Roman Flavian dynasty that invented Christianity. So the claim of apostolic authority, while obscured, or what's the word, obfuscated, I'm not sure, um, by the apostolic succession, the claims of apostolic succession, there is a direct line of legacy to the Roman Flavian dynasty, and it flows through all of these early Christian leaders who had some form of the name Flavius or Flavian or Flavia. Um, they were all uh, descendants, ideologically at least, of the Roman Flavian dynasty. So, so whereas whereas Mary had or the Second Temple represented by the symbol of Mary, and why do I say that? Because we saw in the Hebrew Tanakh how the roots of the name and the circumstances surrounding Miriam, the sister of Moses, and her death refer to episodes of rebellion, and the Hebrew has a suggestion there of rebellion and its roots. it seems to me that Mary is representative of the temple, in that the temple was the final, at least in Jerusalem, the final place of rebellion against the Roman Empire during the siege of Jerusalem and the ultimate destruction of the temple. So Titus pierced the the curtain, uh, but then after that, the temple is destroyed, and then uh, Jesus slash Titus becomes the temple in the Christian religion as a consolation or a replacement uh, for the temple in that quasi Judaism that was Christianity, a perversion really of Judaism. So Titus is born from the womb of the second temple, or the womb of Mary. So Jesus slash Titus is born from his mother Mary when he enters the most holy place and the temple is about to finally burn down. And then he invents this quasi Judaism where he takes on this new name, Jesus, uh, in the Christian good news accounts or gospels, because it's good news for Gentiles, but it was pretty much bad news for Jews. And of course, good news. Uh, Joseph Atwill says good news of military victory or military conquest by the Romans, but that's in opposition to the evil report of the spies that entered the land of promise to scout it out, and then came back with a report that deflated the spirits of, or the enthusiasm, or even maybe the faith of the children of Israel when they came back with reports about how formidable the inhabitants of the land appeared to be. However, there were two, if I remember correctly, who came back and basically just said that, don't even pay attention to these reports because I think I'd have to go back to the text to look, but I'm sure they said something to the effect of, we've got the Creator on our side, so why should we fear? Then if we go back to the proto-evangelium of James, was it Anna who is said to thrust her finger into Mary to get evidence of her virginity, or even perpetual virginity, and then her hand is stricken. I forget if it says by fire. Let me see real quick because that's kind of important. Let's see, proto evangelium of James. Yes, here. This isn't, I don't think this is the one I used before, but whatever. Let's try finger. Okay, so it was, I guess it was Salome, not Anna. And a virgin has brought forth a thing which nature admits not of. Then said Salome, as the Lord my God lives, unless I thrust in my finger and search the parts, I will not believe that a virgin has brought forth. And the midwife went in and said to Mary, Show yourself, for no small controversy has arisen about you. And Salome put in her finger and cried out and said, Woe is me for mine iniquity and mine unbelief, because I have tempted the living God. Behold, my hand is dropping off as if burned with fire. So here, Mary's womb, or at least the entrance to her womb, ultimately, a doubter enters, and then her hand is dropping off as if burnt with fire, like the temple in its final moments was burning with fire. So there's another thematic parallel between the Second Temple and Mary. Now, finally, in where it says in Gittin 56b, Titus took a sword and cut into the curtain or the veil separating between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, and a miracle was performed and blood spurted forth. Blood from the curtain, because the curtain represents the hymen of virginity, and that blood was taken as the proof of virginity on the night that a marriage was consummated in the as described in the Torah. And seeing the blood, he mistakenly thought he had killed himself. So here it says that this is a euphemism for the Creator, that Titus saw blood issuing forth from the curtain in the Creator's meeting place, the temple, and he took it as a sign that he had succeeded in killing the Creator himself. However, there's another possibility here, and that was that in killing himself, that this was Titus killing his Gentile self when he became Jesus, the new man God or son of God, eventually whole God. And there's a reason for that in the Flavian dynasty's history. In this new Christian religion he was inventing, this new quasi Judaism that must have been tremendously apparent, was needed, at least in the mind of this Gentile, to fill in the void created by the destruction of the temple, at least for the Jewish people. However, the Jewish community really wasn't going for that, because the Jewish community knew from their history that they had had periods before where the temple wasn't standing, and they survived it, continuing with their observance of Torah. So whereas Titus may have thought that the destruction of the temple would put an end to Judaism, Jews had already experienced in their history a period when the temple wasn't standing, so they knew they didn't need the temple to survive, as a religious people. So the Gentile mind would have, seen this as, oh, I just really, I've just really put the Jews to shame, and surely they're not going to want to um, rebel anymore after this because we've soundly beaten them, blah blah blah, and we've put their deity to shame also. But like Jews don't see it that way. There's nothing in the Torah that says if a Gentile comes along and he puts me to shame that you should stop observing the commandments of the Torah. So regardless, observant Jews are going to go on being observant Jews, and that's not something that a Gentile might immediately appreciate, especially since the Titus, a lot of what he was learning about Judaism, he may have been learning from Flavius Josephus, and it was, I think, only at this time that they may have gotten a copy of the Torah that they could take back to Rome and study for themselves and better learn uh, about Judaism and the Torah. Um, anyway, so this this line about he thought he had killed himself may actually refer to the termination of Titus's uh, Gentile life and his new life as this figure Jesus in the Christian myth. Now, we know that Titus went on to become emperor, succeeding his father, and and was known as Titus. So his Gentile self didn't really die, but yet he did have an alter ego that was born on that day. If the Christian Gospels weren't beginning to be written before that, and I kind of suspect they might have been, the same way Marcus Aurelius might have been writing some of his Stoic philosophy while in the tent during uh, military campaigns. Vespasian and Titus might have been doing the same thing because, along with the physical war with the Jews, um, he surely recognized that he had to carry on an ideological war or a psychological war or an emotional war with his enemies. The Romans weren't, stupid. So, in fact, like I think one of the admitted causes for the fall of Jerusalem and or the destruction of the temple is that the the sages, I guess, it confessed that they did not deal wisely with the Romans. So just as the Romans were dealing with the Jews in a sophisticated and subtle or wise way, wise in the Gentile idea of wisdom, the the Jewish sages believed that they didn't meet the Romans in that at their level of wisdom in handling these situations. And I mean, that's in their defense. That's kind of the clear sight of hindsight, you know. Unless they could read minds, I don't know how they would have anticipated the complexity of Roman strategy. Um, you know, so I mean, they could have perhaps through revelation, but I think that it's enough that Judaism just survived this episode, and the Roman Empire, at least in its form then, came and went. Um, I think the Roman Empire still continues on through the Catholic Church, but how much power it has in comparison to the old Roman Empire would be something to consider. But I think that it still exists. Anyway, um, so I wanted to cover those points because I felt like I didn't cover them sufficiently in the last part 3. So, another thing I wanted to point out, or that I did point out the first time I recorded this video, is about the destruction of Pompeii and Her- Herculaneum when Mount Vesuvius erupted only 9 years later, 9 being the number of judgment, right? And then Pliny the Elder um, died there, and I think published with Pliny the Younger's letters to Tacitus on the eruption. Now, Pliny the Elder I really should get a cough drop or something. No. Let's see, I'm looking for. Yes, Pliny the Elder, the Roman writer and naturalist, did describe the Roman war against the Judeans, including mentioning the destruction of Jerusalem and the establishment of Roman colonies in Palestine by Vespasian. He lived during the time of the Roman Empire, and his writings offer insights into the events of his era, including the Roman-Jewish conflict. He described Jerusalem as by far the most famous of the cities of the East at the time of its destruction. Pliny's writings include accounts of the destruction of Jerusalem and the establishment of new colonies in Palestine by Vespasian. His description of Judea likely relied on material from the period of Herod, which he adjusted to the situation of his time. Pliny the Elder died in AD 79 while attempting to rescue a friend and her family from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So, anyway, I just find it a little interesting. Some might say it's coincidental that there was this cataclysmic destruction that happened 9 years later in Pompeii. Um, While not as famous as Rome itself, Pompeii was a thriving commercial hub and popular resort town for wealthy Romans in the Bay of Naples, known for its villas and wine industry before its catastrophic destruction by Mount Vesuvius in 70 AD. The eruption, which covered Pompeii in volcanic ash, paradoxically preserved the city, offering a unique glimpse into Roman life and urban planning. Almost like someone wanted people to witness the destruction in a more pristine state. Herculaneum, while not as large or commercially significant as Pompeii, was a renowned seaside resort for wealthy Romans, known for its pleasant climate, beautiful coastal views, and luxurious villas, making it a popular retreat for the Roman elite. Um, Notable residents was home to the country retreat of Consul Appius Claudius Pulcher and one of the town's most famous residences. The Villa of the Papyri was identified as the former home of the politician, Epicurean philosopher, and father-in-law of Julius Caesar, L. Calpurnius Piso, which often comes up as a theory of, I think, the creation of Christianity. One that I don't readily subscribe to. Um, while Herculaneum was a smaller town than Pompeii, it was richer and more exclusive, catering to the needs of the Roman elite. Um, Unlike Pompeii, it was buried under volcanic mud rather than ash, leading to better preservation of its buildings and artifacts. So, 9 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, or conquest at least of Jerusalem, paintings portrayed as being on fire in numerous places, and the burning down of the temple, then Pompeii and Herculaneum were hit with these pyroclastic flows of superheated um, rock, ash, gas, I don't know, that would just incinerate people instantly. Um, but I guess that's just a coincidence. And that it struck the Roman elite who, um, so that Pliny the Elder died there. Um, I wonder if we can. Major volcanic eruptions in the Roman Empire before and after Mount Vesuvius. Um, Before and after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the Roman Empire experienced other volcanic events, including the Avellino eruption around 1800 BC. Was the Roman Empire around in 1800 BC? This says 27 BC to 395 AD. Pre 79 AD Vesuvius eruptions. Vesuvius had erupted many times before the eruption of 79 AD, with some eruptions causing earthquakes and damage in the region, but nothing like what happened in 79 AD. There was an earthquake in 62 AD. A major earthquake shook the region around the Bay of Naples, particularly Pompeii, causing widespread destruction. Minor earthquakes before 79 AD. So, I mean, that's all it's got to tell us about. So, there was this huge eruption, and then it just happened to occur 9 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Excuse me. Um, so we can close this. We can close that. So now I'm going to read from Flavius Josephus, the about the destruction of the temple. So I'm going to start where the fires begin to set, as far as I can tell. I've read this before, but I'm not sure that this is the exact start of the fires, but it seems to be. Now, an effort seems to be made to insulate Titus Flavius from the destruction of the temple, as if he was somehow not responsible. I think an effort is also made to show that the legions would obey Vespasian and Titus according to their military discipline. In fact, the Christian scriptures describe the Roman forces this way, and so that you've got someone who's supposedly the Jewish Messiah, who's astounded and amazed about how superior Roman faith is. The faith of the Roman military is to the children of Israel. That's how Jewish this guy is, right? So, before I start, let me make sure I get like a cough drop or something. Okay, in the meantime, the Jews were so distressed by the fights they had been in with the Romans, led by Titus, as the war advanced higher and higher, and creeping up to the holy house itself, that they, as it were, cut off those limbs of their body which were infected, in order to prevent the distempers spreading further. So there, I guess the Roman invaders are described as a distemper, like an infection, for they set the northwest cloister, which was joined to the Tower of Antonia, which is a Roman fortress that overlooked, I think, part of the temple. They set it on fire, and after that, break off about 20 cubits of that cloister, and thereby made a beginning in burning the sanctuary. 2 days after which, or on the 24th day of the forenamed month, Panemus or Tammuz, the Romans set fire to the cloister that joined to the other, when the fire went 15 cubits farther. The Jews in like manner cut off its roof, nor did they entirely leave off what they were about till the Tower of Antonia was parted from the temple, even when it was in their power to have stopped the fire. Nay, they lay still while the temple was first set on fire, and deemed this spreading of the fire to be for their own advantage. However, the armies were still fighting one against another about the temple, and the war was managed by continual sallies of particular parties against one another. So now we have to keep in mind that it's very possible that these supposed Jewish resistance fighters, uh, the leaders of these resistance fighters, some were fighting each other. And whereas I said before that I thought there were three of them, or two of them, there were three of them. There was John and Simon, and then there was a third one, either Menachem or Eleazar. I forget exactly. So, and then these guys are fighting each other, so that you supposedly have this Jewish infighting going on, while they're also besieged by the Romans round about. Um, and and I think that it's really possible that some of these resistance elements were actually controlled opposition. That the Romans had people on the inside doing things during the siege. Now there was at this time a man among the Jews, low of stature he was, and of a despicable appearance, of no character either as to his family, or in other respects his flame, or in other respects his name, I guess, was Jonathan. He went out at the high priest John's monument, and uttered many other insolent things to the Romans, challenged them best of all to a single combat. But many of those that stood there in the army huffed him, and many of them, as they might well be, were afraid of him. Some of them also reasoned thus, and that justly enough, that it was not fit to fight with a man that desired to die, because those that utterly despaired of deliverance had, besides other passions, of violence in attacking men that could not be opposed, and had no regard to God himself, and that to hazard oneself with a person whom, if you overcome, you do no great matter, and by whom it is hazardous that you may be taken prisoner, would be an instance not of manly courage, but of unmanly rashness. I, I like that because, at least in American culture, there are lots of really stupid people, men I'm speaking of mostly, although the women are becoming more masculine and acting in the same manner. But you've got a lot of men who think that manly courage is displayed by unmanly rashness. They just act stupidly, impulsively, like dumb beasts, and women even seem to interpret that as manly courage when it's just unthinking stupidity. We've got whole mobs in America right now operating on this unthinking stupidity. So there being nobody that came out to accept the man's challenge, and by the way, like this is not easy reading. Flavius Josephus, he's got these long run-on sentences, at least the way it's translated, and it can be difficult to keep up with. So there being nobody that came out to accept the man's challenge, and the Jew cutting them with a great number of reproaches as cowards, for he was a very haughty man in himself and a great despiser of the Romans, one whose name was Pudens, of the body of horsemen, out of his abomination of the other's words, or his disgust, and of his impudence withal, and perhaps out of an inconsiderate arrogance on account of the other's lowness of stature, ran out to him and was too hard for him in other respects, but was betrayed by his ill fortune, for he fell down, and as he was down, Jonathan came running to him and cut his throat, and then, standing upon his dead body, he brandished his sword, bloody as it was, and shook his shield with his left hand, and made many acclamations to the Roman army, and exulted over the dead man, and jested upon the Romans, till at length one Priscus, a centurion, shot a dart at him as he was leaping and playing the fool with himself, and thereby pierced him through, upon which a shout was set up both by the Jews and the Romans, though on different accounts. So Jonathan grew giddy by the pain of his wounds, and fell down upon the body of his adversary, as a plain instance how suddenly vengeance may come upon men that have success in war, without any just deserving the same. So I don't know how relevant that paragraph was to the destruction of the temple, but I'm just reading here to make sure I cover it all. But now the seditious that were in the temple did every day openly endeavor to beat off the soldiers that were upon the banks, and on the 27th day of the forenamed month, Panemus or Tammuz contrived such a stratagem as this. They filled that part of the western cloister which was between the beams and the roof under them with dry materials, as also with bitumen and pitch, and then retired from that place, as though they were tired with the pains they had taken, at which, so seditious would be the rebels, at which procedure of theirs, many of the most inconsiderate among the Romans, who were carried away with violent passions, followed hard after them as they were retiring, or retreating, and applied ladders to the cloister, and got up to it suddenly. But the prudent part of them, like the wise part of them, when they understood this unaccountable retreat of the Jews, stood still where they were before. However, the cloister was full of those that were gone up the ladders, at which time the Jews set it all on fire, and as the flame burst out everywhere on the sudden, the Romans that were out of the danger were seized with a very great consternation, as were those, golly, as were those that were in the midst of the danger in the utmost distress. So when they perceived themselves surrounded with the flames, some of them threw themselves down backwards into the city, and some among their enemies in the temple, as did many, leap down to their own men and broke their limbs to pieces. But a great number of those that were going to take these violent methods were prevented by the fire, though some prevented the fire by their own swords. However, the fire was on the sudden carried so far as to surround those who would have otherwise perished. As for Caesar himself, that's Titus, like they're already they're already referring to him as emperor. um, I guess because this was written maybe when Titus was emperor, but then I don't know, maybe as son of the emperor he held this title somehow. I don't know. As for Caesar himself, he could not, however, but commiserate those that thus perished, although they got up there without any order for so doing, since there was no way of giving the many relief. Yet was this some comfort to those that were destroyed, that everybody might see that person grieve, for whose sake they came to their end. For he cried out openly to them, and leaped up, and exhorted those that were about him to do their utmost to relieve them. So every one of them died cheerfully, as carrying along with him these words and this intention of Caesar as a sepulchral monument. So now it's they're calling you see that word, right? Sepulchral. We've been talking about this word in the videos about the alleged death of Nero, and of course we we know this word from the Christian good news accounts or gospels. Some there were indeed who retired into the wall of the cloister, which was broad, and were preserved out of the fire, but were then surrounded by the Jews. And although they made resistance against the Jews for a long time, yet were they wounded by them, and at length they all fell down dead. At the last, a young man among them, whose name was Longus, became a decoration to this sad affair, and while every one of them that perished were worthy of a memorial, this man appeared to deserve it beyond all the rest. Now the Jews admired this man for his courage, and were further desirous of having him slain. So they persuaded him to come down to them, upon security given him for his life. But Cornelius his brother persuaded him on the contrary, not to tarnish his own glory, nor that of the Roman army. He complied with this last advice, and lifting up his sword before both armies, he slew himself. Yet there was one Artorius among those surrounded by the fire, who escaped by his subtlety, for when he had with a loud voice called to him Lucius, one of his fellow soldiers that lay with him in the same tent, and said to him, I do leave thee heir of all I have, if thou wilt come and receive me. Upon this he came running to receive him readily. Artorius then threw himself down upon him and saved his own life, while he that received him was dashed so vehemently against the stone pavement by the other's weight that he died immediately. Sorry, veteran humor. This melancholy accident made the Romans sad for a while, but still it made them more upon their guard for the future, and was advantage to them against the delusions of the Jews, by which they were greatly damaged through their unacquaintedness with the places and with the nature of the inhabitants. Now this cloister was burnt down as far as John's tower, which he built in the war he made against Simon over the gates that led to the Xystus. The Jews also cut off the rest of that cloister from the temple, after they had destroyed those that got up to it. But the next day the Romans burnt down the northern cloister entirely as far as the east cloister, whose common angle joined to the valley that was called the Kedron, or here Cedron, and was built over it, on which account the depth was frightful, and this was the state of the temple at that time. The Kedron Valley, a valley that separates the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives, runs along the eastern side of the old city of Jerusalem, and its walls define the boundaries of the old city. So there's the Temple Mount wall. I don't know if that's the one that existed in the first century, and then the Kedron Valley. So that's quite a height there, as it says. I guess maybe this is another picture of it here. So, um, and this was the state of the temple at that time. Now, of those that perished by famine in the city, the number was prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war was commenced presently, and the dearest friends fell a fighting one with another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable supports of life. Nor would men believe that those who were dying had no food, but the robbers would search them when they were expiring, lest any one should have concealed food in their bosoms, and counterfeited dying. Nay, these robbers gaped for want, and ran about, stumbling and staggering around like mad dogs, reeling against the doors of the houses like drunken men. They would also, in the great distress they were in, rush into the very same houses 2 or 3 times in one and the same day. Moreover, their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew every thing, while they gathered such things as the most sordid animals would not touch, and endured to eat them. Nor did they at length abstain from girdles and shoes, and the very leather which belonged to their shields they pulled off and gnawed. The very wisps of old hay became food to some, and some gathered up fibers and sold a small weight of them for 4 drachmae. Why do I describe the shameless impudence that the famine brought on men in their eating inanimate things, while I am going to relate a matter of fact, the like to which no history relates, either among the Greeks or barbarians? It is horrible to speak of it, and incredible when heard. I had indeed willingly omitted this calamity of ours, that I might not seem to deliver what is so portentous to posterity, but that I have innumerable witnesses to it in my own age, and besides my country would have had little reason to thank me for suppressing the miseries that she underwent at this time. There was a certain woman that dwelt beyond Jordan. Her name was Mary, her father was Eleazar, of the village, I don't know, Bethazob, which signifies the house of hyssop. She was eminent for her family and her wealth, and uh, So it looks like John 19:29 is the only place that mentions. Um, so here we have Mary in John 19:25, Mary the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. So we got two Marys here. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, name who was taken to be John, um, he says unto his mother, Behold thy son. Um, then he says to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own. And then the word home is added. After this, Jesus knowing that all things were now accomplished, and that the scripture might be fulfilled, saith, I thirst. Now there was set a vessel full of vinegar, and they filled a sponge with vinegar, and put it upon hyssop, and put it to his mouth. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, It is finished, and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. So, so there's hyssop and Mary in close proximity in the Gospel of John. She was eminent for her family and her wealth, and had fled away to Jerusalem with the rest of the multitude, and was with them besieged therein at this time. The other effects of this woman had been already seized upon, such as she had brought with her out of Perea, and removed to the city. What she had treasured up besides, as also what food she had contrived to save, had also been carried off by the rapacious guards, who came every day running into her house for that purpose. This put the poor woman into a very great passion, and by the frequent reproaches and imprecations she eased at these rapacious villains. That's got to be a misscan. She had provoked them to anger against her, but none of them, either out of the indignation she had raised against herself, or out of commiseration of her case, would take away her life. And if she found any food, she perceived her labors were for others, not for herself. And it was now become impossible for her any way to find any more food, while the famine pierced through her very bowels and marrow. Back to this. Luke 2:35, and said unto Mary his mother, Behold, this child is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, and for a sign which shall be spoken against. Yea, a sword shall pierce through thine own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. So, while the famine pierced, so whereas in John, Jesus is thirsty, here Mary is pierced through her very bowels and marrow with hunger, when also her passion was fired to a degree beyond the famine itself, nor did she consult with anything but with her passion and the necessity she was in. That's that's just starvation, man. On serious hunger, it can drive you out of your mind. She then attempted a most unnatural thing, and snatching up her son, who was a child sucking at her breasts, she said, O thou miserable infant, for whom shall I preserve thee in this war, this famine, and this sedition? As to the war with the Romans, if they preserve our lives, we must be slaves. This famine also will destroy us, even before that slavery comes upon us. Yet are these seditious rogues more terrible than both the other. Come on, be thou my food. So she's saying, Come on, be my food, and be thou a fury to these seditious varlets, and a byword to the world, which is all that is now wanting to complete the calamities of us Jews. That's a silly. Those are words. If the story's even true, those would be words put in a mother's mouth. No mother's going to say that. No Jew's going to say that. As soon as she had said this, she slew her son, and then roasted him, and and eat the one half of him, and kept the other half by her concealed. Which that um, anyway, this reminds me of the story of the, maybe Google would help out better. The story of Solomon's wisdom. First Kings 3:16. There then came there two women that were harlots unto the king, and stood before him. And the one said, O my lord, I and this woman dwell in one house, and I was delivered of a child with her in the house. And it came to pass the third day also that I was delivered, that this woman was delivered also, and we were together, and there was no stranger with us in the house, save we two in the house. This woman's child died in the night, because she overlaid it. She rolled over on top of it. And she arose at midnight, and took my son from beside me, while your handmaid, your servant girl, slept, and laid it in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I was rose in the morning to give my children suck, behold, it was dead. But when I had considered it in the morning, behold, it was not my son which I did bear. Really, let's. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first one said, No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. Then the king said, The one says, This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. And the other one says, No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, Bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means slay it. But the other one said, It shall be neither mine nor yours, divide it. And the king answered and said, Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means slay it, she is its mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to render justice. So, upon this, she kept the other half of the cooked baby concealed. Upon this, the seditious came in presently, and smelling the horrid scent of this food, they threatened her that they would cut her throat immediately if she did not show them what food she had gotten ready. She replied that she had saved a very fine portion of it for them, and withal uncovered what was left of her son. Hereupon they were seized with a horror and amazement of mind, and stood astonished at the sight, which she said to them, This is mine own son, and what has been done was mine own doing. Come, eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself. Do you not pretend to be either more tender than a woman, or more compassionate than a mother? But if you be so scrupulous, and do abominate this my sacrifice, as I have eaten the one half, let the rest be reserved for me also. After which those men went out trembling, being never so much affrighted at anything as they were at this, and with some difficulty they left the rest of that meat to the mother. Upon which the whole city was full of this horrid action immediately, and while everybody laid this miserable case before their own eyes, they trembled, as if this unheard of action had been done by themselves. So those that were distressed by the famine were very desirous to die, and those already dead were esteemed happy, because they had not lived long enough either to hear or to see such miseries. This sad instance was quickly told to the Romans, some of whom could not believe it, and others pitied the distress which the Jews were under. But there were many of them who were hereby induced to a more bitter hatred than ordinary against our nation. But for Caesar, or Titus, he excused himself before God as to this matter, and said that he had proposed peace and liberty to the Jews, as well as an oblivion of all their former insolent practices, but that they, instead of concord, had chosen sedition, instead of peace, war, and before satiety, or in other words, I think being well fed, and abundance, a famine. That they had begun with their own hands to burn down that temple which we have preserved hitherto, and that therefore they deserve to eat such food as this was. That, however, this horrid action of eating an own child ought to be covered with the overthrow of their very country itself, and men ought not to leave such a city upon the habitable earth to be seen by the sun, wherein mothers are thus fed, although such food be fitter for the fathers than for the mothers to eat of, since it is they that continue still in a state of war against us, after um, after they have undergone such miseries as these. And at the same time he said this, he reflected on the desperate condition these men must be in, nor could he expect that such men could be recovered to sobriety of mind after they had endured those very sufferings, for the avoiding whereof it only was probable that they might have repented. Now, Joseph Atwill, in his Caesar's Messiah thesis, he has another explanation of this story about the mother cooking the baby, and so you should check that out. But here, what I'm seeing, and I'm not saying this is the only meaning of it, but here what I'm seeing is Mary, the temple, her father Eleazar, just as Eleazar was the one associated with the establishment of the ritual of the red heifer, and thus the ordinances performed in the temple. Here, Mary, the temple, is cooking half, or cooking her son, and then consuming half of it, and then offering the other half to the seditious. So to me, this looks like a metaphor for the fire set to the temple. And Titus seems to say as much, according to Flavius Josephus, when he basically says that all this is I offered the Jews peace, but then this is what they did, and they chose this. They chose these bad outcomes rather than the peace that I offered them. Um, that they had begun with their own hands to burn down that temple which we had preserved hitherto. So again, this is, Titus being distanced and insulated from the destruction of the temple because of the charges of impiety for destroying a religious edifice in the empire. Um, and this story about Mary cooking her own son, to me, it just looks like a metaphor for the temple setting, like the temple setting itself on fire and being partially consumed at that point. So that's just what I'm getting out of it, reading it this time, and and I'm not contradicting what Joseph Atwill says about the passage. I'm just gleaning my own understanding from it, and to me it seems harmonious. And I'm not saying that Joseph Atwill's uh, conclusions about that passage aren't also harmonious, but Jewish literature can have multiple levels of meaning. It doesn't have to have just one meaning to it. Uh, Chapter 4. And when the banks were completed and the battering rams brought and could do nothing, Titus gave orders to set fire to the gates of the temple in no long time, after which the holy house itself was burnt down, even against his consent. And now 2 of the legions had completed their banks on the 8th day of the month Lus, or Av, whereupon Titus gave orders that the battering rams should be brought and set over against the western edifice of the inner temple. For before these were brought, the firmest of all of the engines had battered the wall for 6 days together without ceasing, without making any impression upon it. But the vast largeness and strong connection of the stones were superior to that engine, and to the other battering rams also. Other Romans did indeed undermine the foundations of the northern gate, and after a world of pains removed the outermost stones, yet was the gate still upheld by the inner stones, and stood still unhurt, till the workmen, despairing of all such attempts by engines and crows, brought their ladders to the cloisters. Now, crows, is that like a crowbar? Now, the Jews did not interrupt them in so doing, but when they were gotten up, they fell upon them and fought with them. Some of them they thrust down and threw them backwards headlong. Others of them they met and slew. They also beat many of those that went down the ladders again, and slew them with their swords before they could bring their shields to protect them. Nay, some of the ladders they threw down from above while they were full of armed men. A great slaughter was made of the Jews also at that same time, while those that bear the ensigns fought hard for them, as deeming it a terrible thing, and what would tend to their great shame if they permitted them to be stolen away. Okay, so this is the ensign there. It's talking about the aquila, the eagle standard that was carried before the Roman legions. So here again, it's reiterating the fact that it was a shame if those Aquilas should be captured by the enemy. Yet did, and this connects to another video that I did about the Aquila and Unkelos and the eagle and the menorah, and how I suspect that the Aquila that was captured from the Thunderbolt Legion, uh, the Legion Fulminata, I always forget the number, it's either 12 or 13, I think, how that was melted down, and I believe it was melted down into a menorah for the temple, and that's why such a great display is made of the menorah being captured by the Romans on the Arch of Titus, because they wanted the Roman elite, at the very least, to know that the Aquila was recaptured and brought back to Rome. So, yet did the Jews at length get possession of these engines and destroyed those that had gone up the ladders, while the rest were so intimidated by what those suffered who were slain that they retired, although none of the Romans died without having done good service before his death. Of the seditious, those that had fought bravely in the former battles did the like now, as besides them did Eleazar, the brother's son of Simon the tyrant. But when so Simon, I believe that's Simon Bar Giora, if that's the same Simon. So this would be the Simon that I suspect is Nero converted to Judaism. And that's why this Simon is carried back to Rome for execution, public execution. But when Titus perceived that his endeavors to spare a foreign temple turned to the damage of his soldiers, and then be killed, he gave order to set the gates on fire. In the meantime there deserted to him Ananus, who came from Emmaus, the most bloody of all Simon's guards, and Archelaus, the son of Magadatus, they hoping to be still forgiven, because they left the Jews at a time when they were the conquerors. Titus objected to these men as a cunning trick of theirs, and as he had been informed of their other barbarities towards the Jews, he was going in all haste to have them both slain. He told them that they were only driven to this desertion because of the utmost distress they were in, and did not come away of their own good disposition, and that those did not deserve to be preserved by whom their own city was already set on fire, out of which fire they now hurried themselves away. However, the security he had promised deserters overcame his resentments, and he dismissed them accordingly, though he did not give them the same privileges that he had afforded to others. And now the soldiers had already put fire to the gates, and the silver that was over them quickly carried the flames to the wood that was within it, whence it spread itself all on the sudden and caught hold on the cloisters. Upon the Jews seeing this fire all about them, their spirits sunk together with their bodies, and they were under such astonishment that not one of them made any haste, either to defend himself or to quench the fire, but they stood as mute spectators of it only. However, they did not so grieve at the loss of what was now burning as to grow wiser thereby for the time to come, but as though the holy house itself had been on fire already, they whetted their passions against the Romans. This fire prevailed during that day and the next also, for the soldiers were not able to burn all the cloisters that were round about together at one time, but only by pieces. But then, on the next day, Titus commanded part of his army to quench the fire, and to make a road for the more easy marching up of the legions, while he himself gathered the commanders together. Of those there were assembled the six principal persons: Tiberius Alexander, the commander under the general of the whole army, with Sextus Cerealis, the commander of the 5th legion, and Larsius Lepidus, the commander of the 10th legion, and Titus Phrygius, the commander of the 15th legion. There were also with them Eternius, the leader of the 2 legions that came from Alexandria, and Marcus Antonius Julianus, procurator of Judea. After these came together all the rest of the procurators and tribunes. Titus proposed to these that they should give him their advice what should be done about the holy house. Now some of these thought it would be the best way to act according to the rules of war and demolish it, because the Jews would never leave off rebelling while that house was standing. Okay, so there you've got another connection with rebellion to the Second Temple, the temple in Jerusalem, at which house it was that they used to get all together. Others of them were of opinion that in case the Jews would leave it and none of them would lay their arms up in it, he might save it, but that in case they got up in it and fought any more, he might burn it. But it must then be looked upon not as a holy house, but as a citadel, and that the impiety of burning it would then belong to those that forced this to be done, and not to them. So this is similar to the like the rules of engagement or laws of land warfare, where during the global war on terror, we used to try not to destroy any mosques. But then if the insurgents would use the mosque as a platform for fighting, I'm not sure if it was still forbidden to direct fire upon that building or not, but I think sheer practicality would dictate that you would be able to destroy the building at that point. Let's see. But Titus said that although the Jews should get up upon that holy house, although the Jews should get up upon that holy house and fight us thence, yet ought we not to revenge ourselves on things that are inanimate. So it's kind of strange there that he's making the point that the house, the temple, is inanimate, and not animate as you would expect of someone named Mary, instead of the men themselves, and that he was not in any case for burning down so vast a work as that was, because this would be a mischief to the Romans themselves, as it would be an ornament to their... Oh, hold on a second. So, if we go back to Mary and consuming half of the child that she cooked, then we might say that the half that was consumed, the son of Mary, would be Jesus or Titus, and half of him would have been consumed. You could say it was the Gentile half, and then the other half would be this new figure, Jesus, in this new Christian religion. So there we have like the two halves of the same son. One half Gentile, consumed, one half this new quasi-Jew, counterfeit Jewish personality, not consumed. Let's see, and that Titus Titus was not in any case for burning down so vast a work as that was, because that would be a mischief to the Romans themselves, as it would be an ornament to their government while it continued. So Fronto and Alexander and Cerealis grew bold upon that declaration, and agreed to the opinion of Titus. This was the assembly. Then was this assembly dissolved, when Titus had given orders to the commanders that the rest of their forces should lie still, but that they should make use of such as were most courageous in this attack. So he commanded that the chosen men that were taken out of the cohort should make their way through the ruins and quench the fire. So, did this happen? I don't know. Does it seem to be distancing Titus from the destruction of the temple? Yes, it does. Um, I wasn't there, so I can't say. And, you know, how much does it really matter? Uh, Probably not a whole lot. It's because the end result is that the temple was destroyed. Um, they might try to blame the Jews for the destruction of the temple, and certainly Jews blame themselves for it. Um, because from the Jewish perspective, um, they see themselves as having this duty, as laid out in the Torah, of fulfilling these various commandments. And if any either blessing or um, shame, I guess, comes upon them, then it's either through their success or failure at keeping their covenant with the Creator. It doesn't make sense from the Jewish perspective that either blessing or cursing could come upon them through the acts of Gentiles to whom the Torah wasn't given at Mount Sinai. Um, Personally, when Jews see the destruction of the temple caused by baseless hatred, I think that baseless hatred is the baseless hatred of the Romans against the Jews. That's coming from my Gentile perspective, but that's not how Jews see it. The Jews see that baseless hatred as baseless hatred that was happening within the Jewish community. Um, let's see. Now it is true that on this day the Jews were so weary and under such consternation that they refrained from any attacks. But on the next day they gathered their whole force together and ran upon those that guarded the outward court of the temple very boldly through the east gate, and this about the second hour of the day. These guards received that their attack with great bravery, and by covering themselves with their shields before, as it were with a wall, they drew their squadron close together. Yet was it evident that they could not abide there very long, but would be overborne by the multitude of those that sallied out upon them, and by the heat of their passion. However, uh, Caesar or Titus, seeing from the tower of Antonia that this squadron was likely to give way, he sent some chosen horsemen to support them. Hereupon the Jews found themselves not able to sustain their onset, and upon the slaughter of those in the forefront, many of the rest were put to flight. But as the Romans were going off, the Jews turned upon them and fought them, and as the Romans came back upon them, they retreated again until about the fifth hour of the day. They were overborne and shut themselves up in the inner court of the temple. So, can you imagine this Roman cavalry um, on horses, uh, just clippity cloppeting across the stone floor of the temple on the court of the Gentiles? So Titus retired into the Tower of Antonia and resolved to storm the temple the next day. And I always think about, then the horses, as they do, especially in their excitement, they start pooping all over the place. So now you got like big horse patties landing all over the floor of the temple, in addition to all the blood spilled from the warfare. So Titus retired into the Tower of Antonia and resolved to storm the temple the next day early in the morning with his whole army, and to encamp round about the holy house. But as for that house, God had for certain long ago doomed it to the fire, and now that fatal day was come, according to the revolution of ages, as it was the 10th day of the month of, upon which it was formerly burnt by the king of Babylon. Although these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves, and were occasioned by them. For upon Titus's retiring, the seditious lay still for a little while, and then attacked the Romans again, when those that guarded the holy house fought with those that quenched the fire that was burning the inner court of the temple. But these Romans put the Jews to flight, and proceeded as far as the holy house itself. So now you got these Roman soldiers acting as firefighters. At which time one of the soldiers, without, it just seems a little unbelievable to me. At which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders, and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window through which there was a passage. So here it is. At which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders, being hurried on by a certain divine fury, that could refer to Titus, um, as well as the deity of the Hebrews. Um, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house, on the north side of it. As the flames went upward, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any longer, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, since that holy house was perishing, for whose sake it was that they kept such a guard about it. Now a certain person came running to Titus and told him of this fire, as he was resting himself in his tent after the last battle, whereupon he rose up in great haste. So now they further distance and insulate Titus from this fire by saying that he was resting himself in his tent. Whereupon he rose up in great haste, and as he ran to the holy house in order to have a stop put to the fire. After him followed all his commanders, and after them followed the several legions in great astonishment. So there was a great clamor and tumult raised, as was natural upon the disorderly motion of so great an army. Then did Caesar, both by calling to the soldiers that were fighting with a loud voice, and by giving a signal to them with his right hand, order them to quench the fire. But they did not hear what he said, though he spake so loud, having their ears already dimmed by the greater noise another way. Nor did they attend to the signal he made with his hand, neither, as still some of them were distracted with fighting, and others with passion. But as for the legions that came running hither, neither any persuasions nor any threatenings could restrain their violence, but each one's own passion was his commander at this time. Again, this is more distancing. Like all of a sudden, the legions who were so disciplined in following Caesar's orders, right? All of a sudden, none of them are obeying any orders, and they're all their own commander. And as they were crowding into the temple together, many of them were trampled on by one another, while a great number fell among the ruins of the cloisters, which were still hot and smoking, and were destroyed in the same miserable way with those whom they had conquered. And when they were come near the holy house, they made as if they did not so much as hear Caesar's orders to the contrary, but they encouraged those that were before them to set it on fire. As for the seditious, they were in too great distress already to afford their assistance towards quenching the fire. They were everywhere slain, and everywhere beaten, and as for a great part of the people, they were weak and without arms, and had their throats cut wherever they were caught. Now round about the altar lay dead bodies heaped upon one another, and as at the steps going up to it ran a great quantity of their blood, whither also the dead bodies that were slain above on the altar fell down. And now since Caesar or Titus was no way able to restrain the enthusiastic fury of the soldiers, and the fire proceeded on more and more, he went into the holy place of the temple. Okay, so this is where Titus, a Gentile, enters the sanctuary of the temple with his commanders, and saw it, what was in it, which he found to be far superior to what the relations of foreigners contained, and not inferior to what we ourselves boasted of and believed about it. But as the flame had not as yet reached to its inward parts, but was still consuming the rooms that were about the holy house, and Titus, supposing what the fact was, that the house itself might yet be saved, he came in haste and endeavored to persuade the soldiers to quench the fire, and gave order to Liberalius the centurion, and one of those spearmen that were about him, to beat the soldiers that were refractory with their stabs, and to restrain them. Yet were their passions too hard for the regards they had for Caesar. So now, even though they can hear Caesar now, and he's even got other soldiers to punish them for insubordination, now they're just not listening to him. Um, let's see. Yet were their passions too hard for their regards they had for the regards they had for Caesar or Titus, and the dread they had of him who forbade them, as was their hatred of the Jews and a certain vehement inclination to fight them, too hard for them also. Moreover, the hope of plunder induced many to go on, as having this opinion that all the places within were full of money, and as seeing that all round about it was made of gold. And besides, one of those that went into the place prevented Caesar, when he ran so hastily out to restrain the soldiers, and threw the fire upon the hinges of the gate in the dark, whereby the flame burst out from within the holy house itself immediately, when the commanders retired, and Caesar with them, and when nobody any longer forbade those that were without to set fire to it. And thus was the holy house burnt down without Caesar's approbation. That is such utter bullshit. Now, although anyone would justly, that's all just to defend Titus from the accusation of impiety. Now, although anyone would justly lament the destruction of such a work as this was, seriously, you tell me, you've breached the walls of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is already burning, and you're telling me it's not also in your mind to burn down the temple, to destroy the temple? Especially after the great fire of Rome was blamed on supposedly the Christians, right? But Christians didn't even exist back then. All right, so they must have blamed it on so-called Messianic Jews, or on the Jews back then, which would then provide yet another motivation for laying siege to Jerusalem and burning Jerusalem down. Now, although anyone would justly lament the destruction of such a work as this was, since it was the most admirable of all the works that we have seen or heard of, both for its curious structure and its magnitude, and also for the great wealth bestowed upon it, as so here we see like wealth associated with the temple, just as it was associated with Mary in the story earlier. And also, there's a famous saying. Um, the statement, "He who has not seen the temple has not seen a beautiful building," is a quote from the Talmud specifically referring to the second temple in Jerusalem, rebuilt by Herod the Great, and highlights its perceived architectural grandeur. So that's just a Mishnah 15b. The Talmud states, "Whoever has not seen Herod's temple has not seen a beautiful building in his life." Bava Basra 4:8. What does it say there about Solomon's temple? It says Solomon's temple was not exactly a 7-Eleven either. See 1 Kings 6. That's pretty funny. As well as for the glorious reputation it had for its holiness. Yet might such an one comfort himself with this thought, that it was fate that decreed it so to be, which is inevitable, both as to living creatures and as to works and palaces also, or works and places also. So, given that there were this destruction happened on the same day in two different times, you have to wonder how much Titus engineered it that way. Um, However, one cannot but wonder at the accuracy of this period thereto relating, for the same month and day were now observed, as I said before, wherein the holy house was burnt formerly by the Babylonians. Now the number of years that passed from its first foundation, which was laid by King Solomon, till this its destruction, which happened in the second year of the reign of Vespasian, are collected to be 1,130, besides 7 months and 15 days. And from the second building of it, which was done by Haggai in the second year of Cyrus the king, till its destruction under Vespasian, there were 639 years and 45 days. So, chapter 5, the great distress the Jews were in upon the conflagration of the holy house, concerning a false prophet and the signs that preceded this destruction. While the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain, nor was there a commiseration of any age or any reverence of gravity, but children and old men and profane persons and priests were all slain in the same manner, so that this war went round all sorts of men and brought them to destruction, as well as those that made supplication for their lives, as those that defended themselves by fighting. The flame was also carried a long way and made an echo, together with the groans of those that were slain, and became this, and because this hill was high, and the works of the temple were very great, one would have thought the whole city had been on fire. Nor can one imagine anything greater or more terrible than this noise, for there was at once a shout of the Roman legions who were marching all together, and a sad clamor of the seditious who were now surrounded with fire and sword. The people also that were left above were beaten back upon the enemy, and under a great consternation, and made sad moans at the calamity they were under. The multitude also that was in the city joined in this outcry with those that were upon the hill, and besides many of those that were worn away by the famine, and their mouths almost closed when they saw the fire of the holy house. They exerted their utmost strength and brake out into groans and outcries again. Uh, Para did also return the echo, as well as, oh, maybe that's Perea, did also return the echo, as well as the mountains round about the city, and augmented the force of the entire noise. Yet was the misery itself more terrible than this disorder, for one would have thought that the hill itself on which the temple stood was seething hot, as full of fire on every part of it, that the blood was larger in quantity than the fire, and those that were slain more in number than those that slew them. For the ground did nowhere appear visible for the dead bodies that lay on it, but the soldiers went over heaps of those bodies as they ran upon such as fled from them. And now it was that the multitude of the robbers were thrust out of the inner temple by the Romans. So that robbers is like the name that's assigned to by the Romans to some of these resistance fighters, supposedly. Um, Now it was that the multitude of the robbers were thrust out of the inner court of the temple by the Romans, and had much ado to get into the outward court, and from thence into the city, while the remainder of the populace fled into the cloister of that outer court. As for the priests, some of them plucked up from the holy house the spikes that were upon it, with their bases, which were made of lead, and shot them at the Romans instead of darts. So, like they would, I think they would put um, spikes on the top of the temple so that the birds wouldn't perch there. But then, of course, you could also liken that to the crown of thorns. But then, as they gained nothing by so doing, and as the fire burst out upon them, they retired to the wall that was 8 cubits broad, and there they tarried. Yet did two of these of eminence among them, who might have saved themselves by going over to the Romans, or have borne up with courage and taken their fortune with the others, throw themselves into the fire, and were burnt together with the holy house. Their names were Maerus, the son of Belgus, and Joseph, the son of Dalius. So I don't know what that name Maerus looks like, but it looks like another possible Joseph and Mary pairing right there. Of course, that this would be a male instead of a female. And now the Romans, judging that it was in vain to spare what was round about the holy house, burnt all those places, and also the remains of the cloisters and the gates, two excepted, the one on the east side and the other on the south, both which, however, they burnt afterward. They also burnt down the treasury chambers, in which was an immense quantity of money, and an immense number of garments, and other. So now the Romans, judging that it was in vain to spare what was round about the holy house, burnt all those places. So now the Romans, it's admitted, are just going ahead and burning it all. They also burnt down the treasury chambers, in which was an immense quantity of money, and an immense number of garments and other precious goods there reposited. And to speak all in a few words, there it was that the entire riches of the Jews were heaped up together, while the rich people had there built themselves chambers to contain such furniture. The soldiers also came to the rest of the cloisters that were in the outer court of the temple, whither the women and children and a great mixed multitude of the people fled, uh, in number about 6,000. But before some mixed multitude there suggests that, I mean, if it's used the way it is typically used, um, that may suggest that there were non Jews mixed in there. Um, but before Caesar had determined anything about these people, or given the commanders any orders relating to them, the soldiers were in such a rage that they set that cloister on fire, by which means it came to pass that some of these were destroyed by throwing themselves down headlong, and some were burnt in the cloisters themselves, nor did any of them escape with his life. A false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, who had made a public proclamation in the city that very day that God commanded them to get upon the temple, um, kind of like this jagoff. So this is the guy, Ray Epps, who was telling people to storm the Capitol on January 6th. So, um, right, so let's see. False prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, and made a public proclamation in the city that very day that God commanded them to get upon the temple, and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. Now there was then a great number of false prophets suborned by the tyrants to impose all the people, um, who had who denounced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting, and that they might be buoyed up above fear and care by such hopes. Now a man that is in adversity does easily comply with such promises, for when such a seducer makes him believe that he shall be delivered from those miseries which oppress him, then it is that the patient is full of hopes of such his deliverance. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself. You know what? And some of these could have been Roman agents telling these people to do these things. Well, they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, as did plainly foretell their future desolation. But like men infatuated, without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion, and before those commotions which preceded the war, when when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month Xanthicus, or Nisan, at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone round about the altar and the holy house, that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskilful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. So here we have a heifer or a cow led by the high priest, um, brought forth a lamb, Jesus, in the midst of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, and was there made of one entire stone, was seemed to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon running to the captain of the temple and told him of it, who then came up thither, and not without great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. This also appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God did thereby open them the gate of happiness. But the men of learning understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was opened for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed. So if we were to take the symbology backwards to Mary, right? So then this would be like Mary submitting to the Roman God, uh, and saying, let it be unto your servant as you wish. Um, so these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month, Artemisius, or a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops um, soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. Moreover, at that feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." But what is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, or Jesus, the son of Ananus, a plebeian and a husbandman, who 4 years before the war began, and at a time when the city was in very great peace and prosperity, came to that feast whereon it is our custom for every year to make tabernacles to God in the temple, began on a sudden to cry aloud, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, and a voice against this whole people." This was his cry as he went about by day and night in all the lanes of the city. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. Yet did not he either say anything for himself, or anything peculiar to those that chastised him, but still went on with the same words which he cried before. Hereupon our rulers, supposing, as the case proved to be, that this was sort of a sort of divine fury in the man, brought him to the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. Yet did not he make any supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible, at every stroke of the whip his answer was, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem!" So Matthew 24, and woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And that's talking about the fall of Jerusalem. Um, Here it's woe unto thee, Chorazin, woe unto thee, Bethsaida. So in Jeremiah 13, there's woe unto thee, O Jerusalem. So let's see. And when Albinus, for he was then our procurator, asked him who he was, and whence he came, and why he uttered such words, he made no manner of reply to what he said, but still did not leave off his melancholy ditty, till Albinus took him to be a madman and dismissed him. Now, during all the time that passed before the war began, this man did not go near any of the citizens, nor was seen by them while he said so, but he every day uttered these lamentable words uh, as if it were his premeditated vow, woe, woe to Jerusalem. Nor did he give ill words to any of those that beat him every day, nor good words to those that gave him food, but this was his reply to all men, and indeed no other than a melancholy presage of what was to come. This cry of his was the loudest at the festivals, and he continued this ditty for 7 years and 5 months, without growing hoarse, or being tired therewith, until the very time that he saw his presage in earnest fulfilled in our siege, in our siege. In our siege? Why is Flavius Josephus calling it our siege? When it ceased, for as he was going round, okay, I guess he's saying our siege, as if he was a citizen of Jerusalem when he wasn't. When it ceased, for as he was going round upon the wall, he cried out with his utmost force, woe, woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house. And just as he added at the last, woe, woe to myself also, there came a stone out of one of the engines, and smote him and killed him immediately. As he was uttering the very same presages, he gave up the ghost. Gave up the ghost. This guy called Jesus, or Jesus. Now if any, so you noted how it says who asked him who he was. This man did not go near any of the citizens, nor was seen by them. in the years before the war, while he said so. Maybe that means nor did anyone look upon him. Um, Now, if anyone consider these things, he will find that God takes care of mankind, and by all ways possible foreshows to our race what is for their preservation, but that men perish by those miseries which they madly and voluntarily bring upon themselves. For the Jews, by demolishing the tower of Antonia, had made their temple foursquare, while at the same time they had written in their sacred oracles that then should their city be taken, as well as their holy house, when once their temple should become foursquare. I don't know where that's supposed to be from. But now, what did the most elevate them in undertaking this war was but now what did the most elevate them in undertaking this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings, how about that time one from their country should become governor of the habitable earth. The Jews took this prediction to belong to themselves in particular, and many of why wouldn't it when it comes from their literature? And many of the wise men were thereby deceived in their determination. Now this oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian. So basically, this is Flavius Josephus, who's supposed to be a Jewish prisoner of war to the Roman Flavians, saying that the Jewish scriptures are identifying Vespasian, a Gentile, as the Messiah. How's that for ridiculous? Now, this oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian, who was appointed emperor in Judea. However, it is not possible for men to avoid fate, although they see it beforehand. But these men interpreted some of these signals according to their own pleasure, and some of them they utterly despised until their madness was demonstrated both by the taking of their city and their own destruction. So now, chapter 6. And now the Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the holy house itself, and of all the buildings round about it, brought their ensigns, or their aquila, the eagle standards, these graven images of birds, flying things in the heavens, to the temple, and set them over against its eastern gate, and there did offer sacrifices to them. And this, I think, is something predicted in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there did they make Titus imperator, emperor, with the greatest acclamations of joy. Hold on a second, because Vespasian is emperor right now at this point. Imperator. Oh, in ancient Rome, imperator, meaning commander, was initially a military honorific bestowed upon victorious generals by their soldiers, and later became a title used by the Roman emperors, signifying their supreme authority. Okay, so they're just saying that he's a victorious Roman emperor. Roman general, sorry. And with great acclamations of joy. And now all the soldiers had such vast quantities of the spoils which they had gotten by plunder, that in Syria a pound weight of gold was sold for half its former value. But as for those priests that kept themselves still upon the wall of the holy house, there was a boy that, out of the thirst he was in, desired some of the Roman guards to give him their right hands as a security for his life, and confessed he was very thirsty. These guards commiserated his age and the distress he was in, and gave him their right hands accordingly. So he came down himself and drank some water, and filled the vessel he had with him when he came to them with water, and then went off and fled away to his own friends. Nor could any of the guards overtake him, but still they reproached him for his perfidiousness. To which he made this answer: I have not broken the agreement, for the security I had given me was not in order to my staying with you, but only in order to my coming down safely and taking up some water, both which things I have performed, and thereupon think myself to have been faithful to my engagement. Hereupon those whom the child had imposed upon admired at his cunning, and that on account of his age. On the 5th day afterward, the priests were pined with the famine, came down, and when they were brought to Titus by the guards, they begged for their lives, but he replied that the time of pardon was over as to them, and that this very house, on whose account only they could justly hope to be preserved, was destroyed, and that it was agreeable to their office that priests should perish with the house itself to which they belonged. So he ordered them to be put to death. So this is like how much concern and respect, Titus had for Jewish religion. Um, uh, but as for the tyrants themselves and those that were with him, when they found that they were encompassed on every side and as it were walled around without any method of escaping, they desired to treat with Titus by word of mouth. Accordingly, such was the kindness of his nature and his desire of preserving the city from destruction, joined to the advice of his friends, who now thought that the robbers were come to a temper, that he placed himself on the western side of the outer court of the temple, for there were gates on that side above the Xystus, and a bridge that connected the upper city to the temple. This bridge it was that lay between the tyrants and Caesar, and parted them, while the multitude stood on each side, those of the Jewish nation about Sinron and John. I think that must be Simon and John, with great hopes of pardon, and the Romans about Caesar in great expectations how Titus would receive their supplication. So Titus charged his soldiers to restrain their rage, and to let their darts alone. In other words, don't fire arrows at them, and appointed an interpreter, or spears maybe, appointed an interpreter between them, which was a sign that he was the conqueror, and first began the discourse, and said, I hope you sirs are now satiated with the miseries of your country, or satisfied by, who have not had any just notions either of our great power or of your own weakness, but have, like madmen, after a violent and inconsiderate manner, made such attempts as have brought your people, your city, and your holy house to destruction. You have been the men that have never left off rebelling since Pompey first conquered you. So there's a connection of Pompey with the conquering of Jerusalem. And then 9 years later, Pompey would be destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and have since that time made open war with the Romans. Have you depended upon your multitude, while a very small part of the Roman soldiery have been strong enough for you? So blah blah blah. It's just kind of rubbing it all in. I could dwell on this more and glean some additional things from it. What's important, I think, is that Simon, I believe. Anyway, I should read that later. So we basically covered the destruction of the temple as related in Flavius Josephus. We've seen how Mary, even now in these passages, is connected with the temple. So I really believe, and also how rebelliousness is connected with the temple. which we know in Hebrew sounds like Marie. So I really believe that Mary is a symbol or a name for the temple. And I think this might go back to something in Herod's own history, um, where there's another Miriam involved. I think it might be Mariamne. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at it. But anyway, this knowing that Jesus represents Titus Flavius, then um, we cannot believe that anyone named Mary was his mother, because it was Flavia Domitilla Major who was his mother. I'm pretty sure. Let's see. She was the wife of the Roman Emperor Vespasian and mother of the emperors Titus and Domitian. And the crazy thing is, she died in 69. Um, she was banished. Why would she have been banished? What? She was supposed to have died. What? No, not. I don't want the wife of Clemens. I want Flavia Domitilla Major. I thought that's what it was offering me. Domitilla the Elder. Okay. So she died before 69 AD, which was about when uh, um, Vespasian became emperor. And I'm not sure if Flavius Josephus even mentions her death, which you would think would hit hard with Vespasian or even with Titus during his war against the Jews happening at this time. Um, it says the cause of her death and exact date of death are unknown, though Suetonius states that both she and her daughter Domitilla the Younger passed before Vespasian's acclamation as emperor. Why would Domitilla the Younger have been died? Um, After her death, she's often identified with the figure Diva Domitilla, a deified woman of the Flavian dynasty, though there's debate over whether this title belongs to her or her daughter. Evidence for her as Diva Domitilla is provided mostly through her representations on the coins issued during the reign of her son Titus. So, so Titus's mother, Domitilla, is deified, made a god, a goddess, during his reign as emperor. Just like the Virgin Mary is made a goddess in Roman Catholicism. And does it say Domitilla died before she was later deified by her brother Domitian, who also bestowed the honorific title of Augusta upon her. Um, She was born after her brother Titus and before her brother Domitian. At the age of 15, she was married to Quintus Petilius Cerilialus, with whom she had a daughter, the later Christian saint Flavia Domitilla. Um, so the other thing I wanted to point out was, in addition to Domitilla the Elder being deified, and apparently Domitilla the Younger also being deified and made a goddess. Um, this is how we can explain the how both both the Father and the Son are God in the Christian mythos, because Vespasian became emperor first and became the Roman state cult sun god. Then the son Titus became emperor after him and became the Roman state cult sun god. So both father and son became God. So this is going to wrap up part 4 on Miriam, the sister of Moses, the red heifer, the Virgin Mary, and the temple in Jerusalem. And anyway, I'm certainly not going to base any sort of career on the assertions or suggestions, at the very least, that I make here. Um, but I think people should consider these perspectives and the possibility that they're true, because strangely, the Virgin Mary, or Mary the mother of Jesus, and one could say, well, it's because she's a woman, um, she doesn't have a whole lot of detail provided about her, aside from, the whole virgin birth narrative. But she doesn't have a lot of detail provided about her that makes her seem like a true historical figure rather than a mythologized kind of feminine hero, or at the very least uh, a embryonic goddess, a goddess to be. Um, like all nations shall call you blessed. Well, that was really the second temple before it was destroyed, before the Romans, started making war against it, is that there were Gentiles, nations. The word goyim means nations. There were Gentiles coming from all over the Roman Empire and beyond to make pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem and to bring donations there. So, of that Mary, the temple, all nations were calling it blessed in fulfillment of, the Christian scripture. Um, Not really so much in fulfillment of it, but the Christian scriptures kind of like alluding to the historical fact of what Mary really was. It was the temple and the rebellious Jewish resistance fighters, albeit some of them could have been led by Roman false flag operatives. Um, so yeah. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. Um,